Welcome back to the Foundation in C# course. We're currently in Module 2, and this lesson we're going to cover the if, the else, and the switch statements, basically conditionals. So let's jump right into the code. Here I have Visual Studio open. We're going to say create new project down here. We're going to select console app.NET framework, and we'll be using console app a lot. I know I've pointed out before, but this is an easy testing ground for building early applications. You don't want to jump to things where you don't understand all the background behind it. So we're going to start with console UI. So that's what we'll call it. Console, need to type right. Console UI. And this is module 02, lesson 03. We'll hit enter. And the first thing we do is say console.readline. And these patterns of doing the same thing over and over and over again really help cement the foundation of your learning. If you do things a little bit different every time, then you're going to introduce bugs in your system early on in these foundational layers. You really don't want to do that. So I have these little habits I do with every single project type, where I do a little bit of tweaks or a little bit of setup work at the beginning the same way every time. From the user. So let's do that. We're going to say console.writeLine. Actually, console write. So it's console write and console writeLine, which we covered before. But I just want to remind you, console write allows us to write something out without hitting that carriage return at the end. So I'm going to say, what is your first name? : space. So now I have a statement that's asking a question, and that cursor is going to blink right here at the end. And then I'll use console readline in a different way than we're doing it down here. So I'm going to say first name equals console.readline. Now what readline does, this is a method. We can tell that because it's got the parens at the end. And we're going to cover methods in more detail in a little bit. But this method returns a string. And that string is whatever the user typed out on the console. So if they type TIM, that goes in the first name variable. But they could type something else instead, and it would change that first name variable to whatever they typed. So now we have a dynamic value for our first name variable. It could be Tim, it could be Bob, it could be Sue. We just don't know because the user will give us that information. This allows us to start looking at our conditionals. The first one and the most common one you will use is the if statement. Now, if you type if and then tab twice, notice it's a code snippet. So tab twice, it sets up the structure of our if statement. So the structure is we have the actual declaration, if, then we have a set of parens, and inside there we have a value that is evaluated to be true or false. Remember, Boolean contains only true or false? They work really well with if statements. But in this case, the template put just the word true, which means it'll always be true. That's not what we're looking for. But we'll get back to that in a minute. But what happens next? Compares a single equals assigns. Keep that in your mind always. It will trip you up at some point. Trust me, it's tripped me up quite a few times. Fortunately, the compiler is pretty good about telling you you're causing a problem here. And the reason why it tells you this is a problem is because it's actually going to do this work. But the result is a string, not a Boolean. And what it's looking for is a Boolean, a true or a false. Where if we say this equals, then what we're saying is the value of first name the same as, or equal to, the same as this string? And if you ask that question yourself, you have two answers you can give. One is yes or true. The other is no or false. And that's what we've got here. This is going to be evaluated, this statement right here, and the result will either be true or false. If it's true, this code down here will be run. So let's put some code in here to run. I'm going to say CW tab to create the console write line. And I'll say, welcome, Mr. Corey. And you don't need to call me Mr. Corey. That's just an example. So welcome, Mr. Corey. That just identifies that if you say your first name is Tim, you must be me. Now, obviously, there's other Tims in the world, but this is a simplistic application. Now, at the end of this, let's just write, let's just say application done. Just so we know the application is done running, because otherwise we'd have a blank line there. So let's run this and see how it works. So it's going to pop up the console application. It says, what's your first name? My first name is Bob. The application is done. That's all it does. Because it's not Tim. Let's try this again. My first name is Tim. Welcome, Mr. Corey. Application is done. So it compared that value and said, oop, that's correct. Therefore, we'll run this extra line of code. Now, before we go any further, I do want to point something out that's important to know and that is going to take us to a little bit more complex place. But that's okay. You can do it. So this right here, the comparison first name to Tim, I want to run this one more time and just show you something. What's your first name? Tim. T-I-M. Application is done. But it didn't say hello, Mr. Corey. Why is that? Well, it's comparing this string exactly to the value of this first name. So T-I-M, well, capital T, lowercase I-M, is not the exact same thing as capital T, capital I, capital M. Now, you could say, do another evaluation. Well, if first name equals Tim all caps, or Tim with all lowercase. But the problem is now you have a lot of variations just for a simple name like Tim. Imagine what the variations would be on a name like Amanda or Samantha or Timothy. That becomes messy at best. So there are ways to make this better. And I'm going to show you one, even though we really haven't covered methods yet. And we'll cover methods. But essentially a method is just a bit of code that someone else or you have written to do something for us. We've already used methods. Console.write, this is a method. Console readline, this is another method. Console writeline, that's a third method. A method is just a bit of code that does something. That's really the simplistic version of it. And so Microsoft has created these 3 different methods for us to do some work and make our lives very easy. You didn't have to figure out how to pull up that console window or how to do all the complexities necessary to render on it. All you said was console.write or console.writeline. You didn't have to figure out how to know when the enter key was hit and to figure out what text was on the screen, how to display that text until it came off the screen. You didn't really care. You just said console.readline. And so those bits of code help us do our job a little easier, and they make our programming faster because somebody else spent the time to do it once. And that's going to be a recurring theme in programming. If you want to do it once and then reuse it, because every time you do that, you make yourself faster. Real programming, in-depth programming, advanced programming is not really about writing tons of unique code. Instead, the best advanced programming is mostly about connecting existing code bits together. Think of it like Lego pieces. If you're familiar with I wouldn't want to call it children's game. I still love Legos, but the game where you have those little bricks and you put them together and you make shapes, you make buildings, you make vehicles, all kinds of things. Those bricks on their own aren't really anything special, but you can put them together in new and interesting ways to make new and interesting things. That's what we do with methods and with all these other things as well, classes and all the rest. And we're going to learn that over time. But right now I'm giving you little bricks at a time, and over time you'll get more bricks. So let's look at one more thing that can help you out. And that is, after first name, if you hit dot, there's a bunch of methods available to you. If you notice this whole list, the purple boxes are all methods. So there's some properties here, and we'll cover those later. But there's a lot of methods in here. And one of the methods is toLower. There's also toUpper. But toLower, and what it does is it converts a string to the lowercase equivalent. Now, it does not change the value in the variable. So therefore, even though we are saying first name, whatever it is, convert it to lowercase, we're not saving that in the first name variable. We're just using it in this specific spot. This is really convenient because now I can look at the other side and change the T to be a lowercase. And now first name will always be converted to a lowercase. It does not matter if you use uppercase letters or not. It'll always be converted to lowercase for the comparison. And since the other side is all lowercase, then as long as those 3 letters are used in that order and only those 3 letters, then it will be a match. Let's just show this off. Your first name, capital T, lowercase I, capital M. Welcome, Mr. Corey. Application's done. You see, it didn't matter because to lower converted those all to lowercase. So that's a tool to add to your toolbox is to lower. If you need to do a comparison with strings, that's a handy, simple, easy to remember way to do that. Just make sure the comparison on the other side is lowercase as well. So that's the if statement. We have a simple comparison, first name dot to lower equals Tim. If it's true, we run this code. Otherwise, we do not. Now, you've probably heard about the else statement. So let's show that. I'm actually going to comment out this code. We're going to do it over again. I like doing it over again because that way we get that, again, that habit. I'm not going to create a new application because it's just a bunch of extra time that I don't need to do on video, but I think you should in your practice. So, if I tab twice, first name equals, whoops, all lowercase Tim, and let's do that to lower. Then, console write line, hello, Mr. Corey. Else. And you can tab twice. It's just going to put the curly braces there is all it's going to do. Else, CW tab tab, hello, other person. Simple enough. So an else statement is saying, if this is true, run this code. Otherwise, or else, run this code. So now one of these sections is going to run no matter what. Either if it's true, this line, or if it's false, this line. So that's how an else statement works. An else has to be attached to an if statement because what it's using for its evaluation is still this right here. It doesn't have a separate evaluation. So you have if and you have else, and they're connected. And these will operate just like you expect them to. So if my first name is Tim, hello, Mr. Corey, application is done. But now if I change that to be, I'll just say Timothy. Hello, other person, application is done. Because Tim is not Timothy. Therefore, it says the else runs. So that's the if statement and the else statement. Those two can go together or they can operate separately. This does not have an else statement. That's okay. You don't have to have an else statement. But if you do have an else statement, it has to be attached to an if statement. Let's comment that out. We're going to look at a couple of more options. So let's start over again with if first name equals, first name dot to lower, I'll get that eventually, equals Tim, say, hello, Mr. Corey. But instead of an else statement, what if we had another comparison we want to do? What if you want to say, well, if they're Tim, then say hello, Mr. Corey. If it's Sue, say hello, Mrs. Smith. Well, we could do it this way. Else, instead of tabbing twice, hit space, and then if and tab twice. Else if first name to lower equals Sue, console write line, hello, Mrs. Smith. So what this does is if this is true, it runs this code. If it's not true, it comes down here and says, if this is true, run this code. And we can actually stack these as deep as you want to. We can have else if, and else if, and else if, and else if, and continue on down. Now you can't have an else if without an initial if, which kind of makes sense. You wouldn't need an else first, you just need an if at that point. But at the very end, if you want to have, this is pretty common, if you want to have a cleanup piece, so if nothing up here matched, you can still have an else. I don't know who you are. So now we have, if it's Tim, hello, Mr. Corey. If it's Sue, hello, Mrs. Smith. Otherwise, if it's not either of these two, then it's, I don't know who you are. Let's just run that real quick. First name, we've seen Tim. Let's see Sue. Hello, Mrs. Smith. Let's run it one more time. And it's Bob. I don't know who you are. So that's the if, else. This allows you to stack multiple if statements on top of each other. The benefit here, compared to doing separate if statements, and there is a benefit. Let's just compare what this would look like. Comparatively, between these two, if the first one is true. Now, the other thing, if you just have two if statements, so even if you didn't care that performance, how would you do the else? Well, if you put the else back where it was right here, the problem with this is it will do this comparison. And if it's false, it's going to skip over this code, and then it's going to do this comparison. And if it's false, it'll do this code. And that's great. But what if this is true? Well, it's going to run this code, and then it will do this comparison. We know it's going to be false because if first name is Tim, then it can't be Sue. So it's also going to run this code. So it's going to say, hello, Mr. Corey, I don't know who you are. Which makes no sense. You just said, hello, Mr. Corey. And the reason why is because we started reevaluating. Whereas if we do the else if, then we will never run this code unless both this and this are false. So there is a difference. It may seem a little subtle at first, but I tell you what, this is an important difference. Learning how these if statements work and when to use a second if statement versus when to use an else if is really important. Okay, let's comment this out. Now I'm using the comment buttons up here. Notice the Control EC. Whenever I highlight a section and hit the comment button, it puts comments in front of all of them, which means this code no longer runs. But now, if you come back later to the code, you could select part of the code and hit the uncomment button, and now it's back. So just so you know, that's what I'm doing. I prefer that to deleting code in my example projects. In real projects, I delete the code. Now let's make one more change up here. Let's say console.write. What is your last name? Now I want to show you something that you can do, and it's fine to do. It's in some ways more acceptable to do. And that is you can declare your variable and assign it in one step. So you could say string last name equals console.readLine. So notice I am declaring the variable string last name and assign a value. Whereas up here, I declared the variable first and assigned it an initial value, and then I assigned it the real value, I guess. Whereas here, I did that in one step. That's perfectly acceptable. You do not have to declare your variables up top. And in fact, in some ways, that's considered poor form. And that's a memory management thing. It's a tiny thing, but it is an important one to understand at some point. And we will cover that at some point. But for now, just note you can declare your variable as close to where you need it as possible, and that's fine. On the other hand, if it makes it easier for you to read code to have your variables declared up top, then do so. If it makes it easier for you to read your code if you have your variables declared in one line and then use a different line, do it. If it makes it easier to do it all in one, great. Code is meant to be read by humans. I know it sounds weird because the computer compiles this, and it does. And the whole reason for the compiler to run it all is because we don't write code for computers to read. That's why it has to compile it, because it changes everything into a language the computer understands. So our code in this way is written for us to read as developers. So we should be writing clean code that's easy to understand. That's why I put spacing between my sections instead of jamming them together. If you jam it together, it's harder to browse through and see what's going on. So for example, this right here is one logical piece. I ask for the last name and I get the last name. This is a different logical piece. It's for first name. So therefore, they're separated by a line. It just makes it easier to read and browse through. Equals Corey. So now it's doing two evaluations. If this is true and this is true, then run this code. Let's say hello, professor. So you see that evaluation now? We've got both evaluating the first name and evaluating the last name. And the only way that this code will run with an and is if both sides are true. That's the only way it runs. So it's not going to say hello, professor, if your first name is Tim, but your last name is Jones. Let's just verify it real quick just to show you. You should always verify your code. My first name is Tim. My last name is Jones. Application's done. He didn't say hello, professor, because the last name is not Corey. If I were to say Tim, Corey, hello, professor. There you go. Now this is where it gets really interesting with the else if. Else if first name dot to lower equals Tim. And you may say, wait. You just asked that up here. And yes, I did. But the difference is I'm not confirming the last name is also Corey. So how will this code be run? When will this code be run in here? Let's just say, hello, other Tim. When will we run this code? Well, if the first name is Tim, but the last name is not Corey. Because if this is true, this has to be false or this code will be run. If both sides are true, this code gets run. Therefore, if this side is true and this side is false, it will not run, but it'll come down here where this side is still true and there is no other side. Therefore, it's going to run this code. Let's just demonstrate that. My first name is Tim. My last name is Jones. Hello, other Tim. Application is done. So that right there allows us to drop through different ideas. Now, we could not flip these around. Because if we said if first name to lower equals Tim, then say hello, other Tim, else if first name dot to lower equals Tim and last name equals Corey, because the first if that gets hit that's true, we run that code. We don't do any of the else's. Because the else's indicate the previous ifs were false. All right, hopefully you're tracking along with me. My encouragement to you is in your practice this week, make sure that you are trying these out after you've tried out the basics of an if statement. Now, just so you know, you can do as many ands as you want. So you can put another and after this and do a third comparison if you had one to compare. Now let's show you another comparison tool you can put in your toolkit. If first name to lower, I remember that time, equals Tim, but instead of and last name to lower equals Corey, let's say if either one of them is true, the whole thing is true. So we could say or. That's two pipe characters. The pipe is right above the enter key, usually on US laid out keyboards, and you have to hold the shift key. It's a straight up and down character. You put two of them there. So if first name to lower equals Tim, or first name dot to lower equals Sue. Now what this will do is it will do a comparison, and if this is true, or if this is true, the whole thing is marked as true, and we run this code. So let's pretend that Sue was co-leading this class with me. Let's just say hello, professor. And let's put their name in there too. So these are $, which is our string interpolation. Okay, so we're going to put the first name in this spot right after professor. So hello, Professor Tim, or hello, Professor Sue. And we'll just do our else statement just so we have, if I can spell it right. I've been spelling it wrong all day. Hello, student. Let's run this. So let's just say that first name is Sue and last name Storm. Hello, Professor Sue. Application is done. So that way, the first name didn't equal Tim, but that's okay because the first name did equal Sue. That's an or statement. Now you can mix and match these if you want. So you can say if first name equals Tim and last name equals Corey, or first name equals Sue and last name equals Corey, or as Storm, sorry. And let's just write that out because I want to show you what I would do just to be doubly clear that you've got the comparisons correct. So if first name dot to lower equals Tim and last name dot to lower equals Corey, or first name dot to lower equals Sue and last name dot to lower equals Storm. Now you see what we're doing here is we're doing, whoops, I forgot the parens over here. We're doing a comparison to see if the professor's full name is correct. So it's either Tim Corey or Sue Storm. The only problem is this or in the middle is going to make it a little funky. Because is it last name equals Corey or first name equals Sue? That's kind of not right. So what we're going to do is we're going to put parens around our sections. So I'm putting parens around the ands. So if I say parens, it's parentheses. It's just easier to say parens. So that's this right here and this right here. Open and close paren. So this works just like math, where if you have parens around something, it does that first. So it's going to do this comparison, and it's going to do this comparison, and take the results of those, and then do an OR on that. So first name equals Tim and last name equals Corey. If that's true, font size because of the video, but that's still an awful large if statement. What you can do is you can use the enter key. So now I have this first comparison, the OR, and the second comparison on two different lines. And that's okay. And the reason why that's okay is because the compiler looks for certain things. So for an if statement, it says, I'm going to look for this opening paren and this very last closing paren. And everything inside I'm going to look at as the evaluators, even if there's multiple lines. Down here, it's the same thing. Technically, I could have hit enter here. And I could hit enter here. And I could hit enter here. Don't do it inside your string, that causes a mess. But that technically works because what it's saying is, I'm going to look for a semicolon. And everything up until that semicolon is considered one line of code. So you can actually have it on multiple lines if it makes sense. I would encourage you, put it on one line. If the line gets too long, then yes, look at putting on two lines. But maybe look and see if your code might not be better served in a different way. Because typically you don't need long lines of code. Typically. There are some exceptions. All right, so now we have seen the and, we've seen the or, we've seen both the if and the else. We've also seen else if. There's a couple more things I want to show you. Just real quick, just so you understand that yes, they do exist, and yes, you can use them. The first one is the not equal to. If first name to lower is not equal to Tim. You see that right here? It's exclamation point equal, single equal. That is not equal to. We call this character right here, just so you know, we call it a bang character. Yes, I know it's an exclamation point. Why do we call it a bang character? I'm not even sure, but that's another word, another name for it. So if you hear that somewhere, or a person says bang equal, it just means not equal. Just so you're aware. So that would say that if the name is anything but Tim, then do this. So that is the not equal to. And I won't run all this code. But let's say you had int, let's just say age equals 39. If age is greater than 40. So greater than works. We can also do if age is less than 18. That also works. If age is greater than or equal to 21. And put my spacing back in there. I like to keep spacing consistent. If age is less than or equal to 12. So all these work, and they work exactly how you expect them to. So this comparison right here says that if age is greater than 40, meaning age must be 41 or higher, since it's an int, a whole number. Age is less than 18, means age must be 17 or lower. Age is greater than or equal to 21, age must be 21 or higher. Age is less than or equal to 12, that means age is 12 or lower. So those comparisons all work as well. And they, of course, still work with the ands and the ors and all the rest. So that is the other comparison tools you can use in an if statement. And that's really all there is to if. If is fairly simple, and yeah, it's really powerful. You can do a lot with if, and really powerful programs have been written using not much more complicated logic than the if statement. So get to know it, practice it a lot. This is foundational stuff we're working on right here. This is the bottom layer of building bricks. Your entire application will be built on stuff like this. So know it cold. Learn it, use it. Okay, let's move on to the other conditional operator I want to show you. We're not going to go too deeply into it because it's not as commonly used. In some ways, rookie programmers tend to lean towards this because it seems simpler and in some ways more powerful. But trust me, it's not as powerful. However, I think you need to see it because you're going to see it in other people's code and you need to know how to use it. So the switch statement. And then you create a bunch of case statements. And the case is essentially a comparison. So where we said up top, first name to lower equals Tim, well, think of this case as what it's comparing to. So it takes the value of first name to lower and compares it to Tim. If that comparison is equal, then it runs this code. And then it hits the break. The break says I'm done with the switch. But if it's not Tim, it comes down here to Sue. And if the first name to lower is Sue, then it runs this code, and then it hits the break and ends the switch statement. If neither of these is true, then it comes down to the default, and it runs the code. Think of this like the else statement. Again, it hits the break, and it's done the switch statement. So in some ways, this is like an if, else statement, but it's rather simplified. And here's the reason why. Notice that I can't also put in here last name somehow. Else statement is the more powerful, easier to use, and just plain better solution. So I did want to cover that, but I don't want to belabor the point or to go into more depth, because the reality is we'll come back to this about probably 2 more times in our lessons, but it's just for minor little bits, not for a major role in programming, especially not like the if statement. All right, so that is the lesson. We've covered both the switch statement down here, as well as the if, the else if, and of course the and, the or, the greater than, less than, not equal to it, equal to, and all the rest. The big keys, remember, this one's going to trip you up at least once, the double equals versus single equals. Just remember, double equals is a comparison, single equals is an assignment. Okay, for your homework for this lesson, I want you to create a console application that asks the user for their name and then welcome them or welcome me as professor or anyone else as student. Now here's a trick with your homework. I don't want you to look at the screen, look at the video, pause it, and just type what I typed. Because really that's all this is essentially typing what I've already typed. Instead, I want you to do this from memory. Not because I want you to memorize stuff. Memorizing things is not nearly as big a deal in programming as you'd think it would be. When you go to college and they teach you programming, they try and make you memorize all these terms. The reality is that's not nearly as important as you think it is, or as they think it is. But there is something to be said for being able to write this basic foundation level code without having to look at an example. That's not true for code later on. Later on, it's okay to look at an example and redo it. I do that. But for this foundation level course or this foundation level code, I would like you to practice the if statement a few times while watching my code until you're comfortable enough that you don't have to look at my code. Then do this homework. When you do that, and you're confident you can do an if statement, and you have a couple of those, else if, and the ands, the ors, you try those things out, and only then move on to the next lesson.